So, as I said last time, Thrasymachus has this really radical challenge to the idea that most Greeks would have of justice, and I think it's a radical challenge to our own ideas about morality. If you went through and hit find replace for every time Socrates and Thrasymachus talk about justice and you replace justice with morality, I don't think you would really change the meaning too much. You'd change it a bit, but you really wouldn't distort things wildly, right? Thrasymachus says, well, justice is just this system of control put in place by the powerful, the strong, that being whoever happens to be in charge in a society to control everyone else and to benefit those in charge at the expense of everyone else. And if that's true, then we're a sucker for trying to be just or trying to be moral, and we shouldn't do it anymore. We should be as unjust and as immoral as we can get away with being. Now, that is a really interesting claim, right? You might think it's frightening, you might think it's exciting, you might think it's both. But, well, something being interesting does not mean it's true, right? Newspapers will often, the media generally, give a lot of coverage to something just because it's interesting, but interesting does not equal true. In fact, and this is something I want you guys to learn from this class and to keep in mind from this class, the more interesting meaning the more out there or weird or surprising a claim is, the more evidence, the more argument you need for that claim. And so Thrasymachus gives us a really surprising, really out there claim. He needs some pretty good evidence for it. Well, what evidence is there? Well, as I said, Thrasymachus will quote a lot of figures from ancient Greek society that we're not familiar with, throw out a lot of examples that unless you study ancient civilizations, you're just not going to know. But I think we can fill in the examples from our own experience, right? And one bit of evidence is that moral rules do differ from society to society, right? We have different laws than North Korea or Iran, but we also, just beyond laws, there seems to be a different set of moral rules, right? Justice, there's the laws in place, but there's also the moral rules. That seems to fit with what Thrasymachus says, and Thrasymachus can give us a decent explanation for this, right? He'll say, well, why are these moral rules different? Because different people or groups of people are in charge in each society. More than that, it is not at all hard to think of examples where the moral rules, where the system of justice benefits some ruling group at the expense of everyone else. Benefits this ruling group, harms everyone else. And we can find, we don't need to go to North Korea or Iran or ancient Greece or wherever to find an example. We just need to go back in time a bit, consider the South before the Civil War, right? Obviously, slavery was terrible for the people who were enslaved, right? That goes without saying. But it's actually, if you look into it, it was a bad system for pretty much everybody, right? The only people who really benefited from it were the planters who owned the plantations, the slave traders, and a few people who did business with them. Everybody else in the South did worse than they would have otherwise did because you had to compete with these planters who didn't have to pay the people who worked for them, right? Other farms couldn't compete. Other people who had to sell their labor had their wages driven down. Not for a second to deny it was worse for the enslaved than anybody else, but this was not a system that benefited anybody except a tiny little sliver of the population. But notice this. Many people who were harmed by that system were convinced that it was in some way right. Lots of people who did not own slaves, who were poor, went off to fight for the South in the Civil War, right? We can guess at why they did that, but if we look at fiction, we can even find a better example from this time period of what Thrasymachus has in mind. Take the adventures of Huck Finn. And I'll come back to this because there's a really good essay by Jonathan Bennett that we will read later on the conscience of Huck Finn. But I think it's just a wonderful example of what, maybe not wonderful, maybe awful, but it's a very powerful example of exactly what Thrasymachus has in mind. In the novel, Huck is a very poor boy. His father's abusive. They are the poorest you can be in this society without actually being slaves, right? Everybody, except for a few people, treats Huck badly. Huck decides to run away from his abusive father and some other things. And one of the very few people who's kind to Huck, who actually seems to look out for him, is this runaway slave, Jim, right? He's maybe one of Huck's few real friends in the world, but Huck feels constantly guilty that he's helping Jim escape. And there's a scene in the novel where he has a crisis of conscience because he's helping Jim escape and he thinks he's doing this terrible thing, right? Now notice, the system of morality that was in place says, Huck should rat Jim out. If he doesn't, he is, in Huck's own mind, stealing someone else's property. Not only do we think that this would be a terrible thing to do, but notice that it's not in Huck's interest, right? Jim is one of his very few true friends in the world, maybe his only true friend in the world. And the system of morality says, rat out your only true friend to these people who do not have your interests at heart, who treat you badly, who treat you like dirt. That's the morally right thing to do. And I'll note that Twain wrote this because he grew up in Missouri, which was a slave state, and he kind of imbibed this system of morality himself before he later rejected it, right? But he wants to give this picture of how someone like Huck, or someone like himself as a younger person, can internalize this system of morality that's not just horrible, but it's obviously only in the interests of a narrow group of people. If you guys haven't read the novel's hit and miss. Twain did not know how to end a book. He just can't bring the plane in for a landing. The last few chapters, it's like, okay, you don't know how to end this, do you? But anyway, there is a very good scene where Huck thinks, it's like, well, if I don't rat Jim out, I'm going to go to hell, which he decides he doesn't care too much about because he decides that all his other friends besides Jim are going to be in hell, Tom Sawyer being the main one. He decides Tom's probably going to hell. And also that heaven will be really boring because the church services he got drugged to by this widow he lived with were also boring. So he thinks, well, hell won't be that bad. Heaven's probably worse. But he does have this legitimate crisis of conscience. He just feels guilty. Or you want to take an example maybe a little further back. Think about the divine right of kings, right? Medieval European peasants were convinced that the king was put on his throne by God, and this is obviously often not in their interest, right? Because the king was often a complete idiot, often very inbred, and even when he wasn't a complete idiot, generally didn't take a lot of account of the peasants or their interests, right? But you don't challenge your inbred, cruel, stupid monarch because God has put him on the throne. We look at that now and that looks ridiculous. Obviously, these guys are just fooling you peasants so you won't see through the game. Do what you should do with them, which is at the very least kick them out. But, Thrasymachus will say, well, that's all of us. We see that medieval peasants were dumb to fall for this. But you know what? Justice is always like that. Or so says Thrasymachus. I mean, look, people aren't always fooled. England did execute at least one monarch. Not everybody in the South fought for the Confederacy. Plenty of people deserted. But Thrasymachus will say a lot of people do fall for it, right? So that's the kind of evidence he'll give, and I think it's really powerful and really unsettling. So let's look at, in the next lecture, what Socrates' response to this will be. I'd even note in closing, nobody thinks the divine right of kings anymore, but look at our friends over in England, right? I don't see why anybody would think that Mr. Charles Windsor really should be supported by the state or get a palace. But you talk to English people and they'll be like, well, he's a symbol of our country. You need to respect the king. Which just boggles my mind. Old Charlie doesn't seem as bad as some of them. Unlike his great uncle, he isn't an actual Nazi. Look this up. There have been Nazis in the royal family. But just the idea that he ought to live rent-free because he's like some kind of mascot of the state. Not quite as bad as the divine right of kings, but that too strikes me as a little bit of what Thrasymachus, has in mind here, right? All right. Be that as it may, I won't digress. You guys will probably get the impression I don't much care for the royal family of England, and I don't. But, that's neither here nor there after a certain point, is it?